with Renee.
Hey, what's up, world? Welcome to another edition of Saturdays with Renee. Jared Ball, Renee Johnston in the building. What's up, Renee?
What's going on, man? You made it. You look.
Woo!
Yeah. You sweating? You need a towel. You need a glass of ice water.
Oh, wait. Is the let me make sure the mic settings are all there. Hold on a second. All right. Okay. My bad. Yeah. No. Just came crashing in. All puns intended. No, we were safely driving. And made it back from baby girl's soccer tournament, and where she scored what should have been the winning goal, but got to defend for 90 minutes, as they say.
Yeah,
and didn't quite get there. So, but
that is real.
But we're here, all set. We got Lawrence Grand Prix. Happy 420, everybody. And I love that we're able in this way to politicize what is an otherwise sort of kind of a glorious festive day. All right.
I can't you.
I always do this, and I'm forever. For years, I've been having the pleasure of knowing and getting to work with leaders of a beautiful struggle, to see them in action, live and direct, for a very long time. See them in some ways, if I may say, very very old man way, grow up in these activist and organizational streets, as they say, and they're very impressive, doing great work, and it's good to rap with them. And today we get to talk with the director of research for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, right up the street here in Baltimore, Lawrence Grand Prix. Lawrence, good to see you again. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate you.
Yeah,
nice
it's a
to meet
pleasure.
you, Lawrence. Thank you.
Yeah,
for
nice
coming.
to meet you as well.
And by the way, sorry for to the remixers, greetings to you as well. Didn't directly greet our world famous chat. Wanted to so greetings to everybody.
We you know what? No lies. The chat is definitely one of the best on any.
Oh, no question.
on any channel. It's
no question.
Fun. Although sometimes it'd be hard keeping track of what they doing and listening and doing the things.
It's hard to keep track. Can't keep up. Definitely. Is that a reference to the birds outside? Do you all hear that?
We sure do.
Okay, my bad. Okay, right on.
Tree line
streets. Well, yeah. They but yeah, exactly, James. World renowned, exactly. But yes, and Terry, yes, please do like, share, subscribe, do all of those things. But Lawrence, but if you would, I'm fascinated by the particular aspect of your work that relates to today and 420. By the way, what is the history of why is it 420? What is the relevance of that? It's not related to the backlash of this being Hitler's birthday or anything like that, right? There's some other
when you Wikipedia
cannabis related,
they say it was a particularly prominent group of stoners that went to a particular high school that would always smoke at 420, and they just passed it along to their friends.
So it was the time of day.
Take that with a grain of salt.
Okay, thanks. So it's the time of day, not the date. Okay, got it.
Yeah, it's like after school, far enough after school you won't get caught, but close enough to school that you can still have your friends together. I think maybe
that
like
I actually think that is correct.
Or close enough to kicking off time at work if you work a 9 to 5.
that makes.
I actually think that is correct, because if my old self remembers correctly, when I first started working in the high schools, when you saw the 420, it was 4:20. Not 4/20. So it was indeed a time and not a date. back then.
I feel like I should know this.
In the early 2000s. I feel like you should know this too.
I feel like I should know this. But as I was saying, what I do like about this though is that all the sort of jokes aside, with all of the discussion of 420 and cannabis, for all of the discussion of the legalization, and then simultaneously all of the increasing discussion of reparations, what I have not seen a lot of is putting all of that together in a very concrete and organized, planned way. So I'm very excited to have you, if you would sort of, and I know Renee, you wanted to get into the background. Maybe we should start there. Renee's
well, yeah, how about you the worst. This is the first time the man's been on Saturday. Can the man tell everybody who he is?
Oh, my bad.
But Jared.
Let me step back. Go ahead.
If you will, Lawrence.
Yeah. You know, I mean, I've been on the channel a lot. Obviously, we have our podcast on here as well, but since this is my first time on the channel, I'll start from the beginning. My name is Lawrence. Last name pronounced like the race Grand Prix. From Baltimore, Maryland. Lived all over the west side of Baltimore. My mom was a state trooper, and she was a teacher. My father was a police officer in the BPD, Baltimore Police Department. He actually worked undercover narcotics for a period of time. So the stuff you see in The Wire, that's what he was doing. So it wasn't like a revolutionary political upbringing. I mean, I say my father's politics was George Carlin. You know, that's kind of how I was raised, but I was raised by cops. So thinking about the war on drugs and things like that were just always part of my upbringing. You know, our group that I work with leads A Beautiful Struggle, LBS. We are a think tank. We come out of the world of policy debate. Policy debate is like a two-person research rigorous form of debate. It's one topic for the whole country. So you have one topic for high school, one topic for college. You have these big debate tournaments that function like the NCAA basketball tournament, where people come from all over and debate for a weekend. And that community produces a lot of folks who end up, it was basically a form of debate created by West Point, created by the military academy to produce Cold War think tank warriors. And George Soros paid some money to create urban debate leagues. It's basically thinking kids in inner city neighborhoods need some sort of enrichment activity. But that was no real plan for those mostly Black kids in Atlanta and Baltimore to deal with this extremely white, racist community obsessed with the Cold War, nuclear war, and creating the future theorist of American hegemony and empire. So a cadre of Black elders in the debate space basically took it upon themselves to challenge the structure of debate, bring critical race theory not just into debate, but into the very debating the structure of debate itself. Sort of saying we can't address the topic of the Middle East until we talk about anti-Blackness and how we evaluate debates and how debate is structured. And our director of public policy, Davon Love, was one half of the first two-person team of Black debaters to ever win a college debate national championship in 2008. And they were doing that using the works of folks like Charles Mills. They read some evidence from Frank Wilderson, even though we should have a separate conversation. They weren't really doing Afro-pessimism at that time, but we can talk about that later. Davon probably told you about that, because they were doing things that were more sort of in a Pan-Africanist Black nationalist intellectual framework. I came up to the world of traditional debate. So basically, I came to coach debate at Towson to the people who are now my co-founders of LBS with the framework of, I learned all the tricks of the trade from the belly of the beast, from traditional debate teams, how they plan to beat teams like y'all. So let me bring that to the work y'all doing in debate now. And eventually in 2009, they were like, this debate stuff is cool, but we see the people we're debating work at the think tanks that basically write policy that run the world. No one's doing that for folks like us. We want to take our skills off campus, because they were doing campus organizing as well, and create like an actual community organizing think tank entity. And they were like, well, you help us with the research with debate. You can help us with the research for that too. And that was like 15 years ago. So for the past 15 years, it's been applying those research skills to really interject into a variety of conversations, education, criminal justice, police reform. We led a lot of the protests around the Freddie Gray uprising in 2015, but also the policy response, working in Annapolis, because we're not a nonprofit. So we can do direct sort of engagement with the political processes. We made a very intentional decision to not be a nonprofit because of conversations with our elders that basically said a lot of the radical energy of the 60s got sucked into not just COINTELPRO crushing it, but the nonprofit infrastructure, the world where, people's livelihoods depend upon you getting that grant or that federal bequeathment of funds, makes it so that even if you want to be radical, your love of your people sort of forces you to play that game, kind of a captive maternal situation without using that word. So we were intentional to not be a nonprofit, to have a sort of more entrepreneurial social enterprise framework so that we're able to lobby for issues that foundations aren't willing to pay for. So I'll kind of come back to cannabis now. Part of the reason why most of these cannabis bills in many different states suck so much, it's not the only reason, is that foundations were extremely reticent for giving people money to advocate for social justice and cannabis legalization before legalization actually happened in the state. So when the bill was passed, they would give you a pittance of funds to basically come back and make the legalization socially equitable. But they wouldn't want to pay you to advocate for social equity to be baked into the bill itself, because they're afraid of giving money for a group to advocate to legalize a federally illegal substance will potentially subject them to federal government scrutiny, potentially losing their nonprofit status. So we are being independent, not a nonprofit, not doing the cannabis advocacy because we got a grant to do it, but because we saw an opportunity for Black communal self-determination and ownership of public dollars. We started talking about cannabis legalization in 2015. It's probably not going to be till 2025 that the money actually flows. Like, there are no 10-year grant cycles for the most part in the nonprofit industrial complex. But our model allows us to have the consistency to apply the pressure and do the enforcement, not just the policy passing, to get us to the point we can talk about cannabis legalization and using those tax revenues as a way to do reparations to war on drugs.
Whew. See, see. And somebody in the chat was like, "We already know Lars," and then they were like, "Oh, my bad, I didn't know all of this." So I appreciate that, and I feel like I have all these new questions, but they're not really relatable now to the topic. So this means you're gonna have to come back because I need to understand the whole. I was raised by cops.
Yeah,
like
yeah, no, it's a whole thing.
Yeah, that's a whole
thing.
that is a whole conversation.
Talk about that later.
Yeah, that
I'll probably touch on that a little bit today because it is somewhat relevant, but we can talk about it later as well.
Cool. All right, so Jared, you had a question. Now you can ask your first question.
Well, but I also part of it was that I thought you would want to hear also maybe some more about their foundation politically, ideologically, how they approach all of this. So maybe you'd like to say another word or two about LBS's politics and that particular form of approach. Yeah,
I touched on it, and it may come back to what Renee just talked about, but coming from this notion of revolutionary Pan-Africanism, and this is from me, Davon, Adam, so the co-founders of LBS that are still working at it today. None of us were raised within this framework. We were raised in the popular culture caricatures of Pan-Africanism, Black nationalism to some degree or another. Someone really needs to do an extensive analysis of the caricaturing of Pan-Africanism and Black nationalism, especially in the 90s. Even professional wrestling had a group called the Nation of Domination of all Black wrestlers that were parodying the Nation of Islam. So there's just this extensive caricaturing of Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism. And, I intellectually in debate and in school, like, I was socialized more with like European critical theory. So the Deleuze, Foucault, Habermas, sort of that world. But then I realized its limitations, and sort of just working as a working class Black person. All of us went to public schools. I was, it was a Black Catholic church. I was raised in a Black church. So there's this notion of intuitive community, vernacular Black institutions being a hub for social change, I think makes intuitive sense to many working class Black folks, but politically we're kind of socialized out of seeing it as a mature intellectual trajectory for work. But, doing debate, part of what we did was we would, literally read Marimba Ani. Like, I would just cut snippets of Yorugu, and that would be what we would read in debate against a variety of teams like Harvard, and they'd have no answer for it. And it's like, well, if Harvard doesn't have an answer for Marimba Ani, maybe there's something here. Right. So then you would think about sort of doing work in community, we came out of the world of debate to nonprofit. We were like, well, we need Black people to be able to work with Black youth, so we don't have to be socialized in these white nonprofits. That means Black folks got to get the resources, which means that we have to look at the history of Black folks getting resources to community. And what worked what limitations were there, what can we learn, what needs to be thrown away. So we talked to elders, and elders would talk about folks like Perrin Mitchell. Elders would talk about folks like Walter Carter. Walter Carter was part of Baltimore Core. He was part of the application of our model cities poverty programs here in Baltimore. And Baltimore had some of the strongest community oversight committees in terms of actually applying that money on the ground of any city, of any sort of model cities poverty programs in the nation. So coming out of that history, sort of seeing like, okay, so we can use public money if it has some mechanism of community accountability that kind of shields it from some of the politics of the foundation world, that gives you a lever, and not a perfect lever, but that gives you a lever to push back against the strings that are attached to public money, federal money, and the politics of public money, and has empirically been a tool that people have cited that have made stuff better in our communities. So it's like, okay, if that's what that is, what is an example of how we can recreate at some scale the mechanisms of investment from things like model cities and the poverty program with an explicit focus on Black community control? So that's when I looked at Colorado. This would have been 13, 14 when they just legalized. And Colorado is like that Western libertarian type thing. So they actually literally had a moment where they actually refunded the citizens of Colorado. They wrote them all refund checks because they said they were generating too much cannabis tax revenue. And you look at California, California gives 10% of their cannabis legalization money to cops, because, medical cannabis usually isn't taxed because the argument is you don't tax medicine, but recreational cannabis is taxed at different rates in different states, and every state determines where the money goes differently. And when you see California giving 10%, like tens and 20, 30, $40 million every year going to cops, it's like no state has really done an investment mechanism that had any focus on community control. Many states tried to claim they were doing something called community reinvestment. They wouldn't use the term reparations, but it would be so top down. It would be run by political appointees. It would be centralized in the state capital. And what we know is that the more power that's aggregated in political appointees by the governor, speaker of the house, these sort of top-down powerful figures, the less accountable the money is. So we basically set out, based upon that experience of community control, Black power, getting resources to the ground, and our relationship with elders, to construct a theory of reparations in Baltimore that had community control built into it on the front end. So we started talking about literally the day of the first big protest around Freddie Gray. I was supposed to give a talk about this in Baltimore at the Real News Building. And that talk got canceled because of the Freddie Gray protests, right? So this is something that we've been literally working on since 2015. And it's going to be coming to fruition over the next year or so, sort of a trajectory of work of 10 years.
And again, because of what you laid out earlier, the positioning of your organization as a nonprofit, you're able to be at the ground sort of this or early in pushing for this.
Mm-hmm.
So how does the legislation that you all are, well, one, what is the state of the legislation that you all are pushing, and then what is the detail of it, and what is exactly it calling for? And similarly, as you're answering this, or simultaneously as you're answering this, can you tell us what is Maryland's breakdown of the revenue of cannabis, and what would you like to see happen with it?
Okay, so I'll start with the latter and I'll work my way back to the former. So Maryland, it's scattered all over the place. People are paying off like political debts. So some of it, I think like 5% goes to localities to sort of accommodate, their needs in terms of cannabis regulation. That's relatively low, actually. Many states actually have a more robust remittance program to localities, like, the actual counties, to do the regulation and zoning and things like that. There's a chunk of it that goes into like a public health prevention fund. So, worried about youth smoking, want to do educational campaigns, want to do research to see if high driving increases. I think that's like 10%-ish. There's another chunk that goes to supporting cannabis businesses. So that's like another 10-ish%. I think, around 25% goes to the general fund. A certain percentage goes to the statewide cannabis regulation entity. But I think the largest appropriation, 35%, is for the community reinvestment fund. which is what we wrote the statute on. The statute was introduced by Jill Carter, the daughter of Walter Carter, the person who I told you about that did the work with CORE and model cities and the poverty programs. And what it called for was a proportional reinvestment of cannabis funds. Because, the state, some people sort of say, let's focus on the localities because we can just do a piggyback tax in the city and we can just control the money locally. But yeah, so it's one of those things where we were like, no, the state has the biggest pot of money. So don't just focus on the piggyback tax like they do in Oakland, which is good, but it's just a small amount of money. Focus on the big pot of money that goes statewide and demand that it be reapportioned, not held in the state capital. Because again, these things seem technical, but it's the difference between life or death when it comes to community control. If the money stays in the state capital, most people don't even know who that state senator is. Most people, know who that city council person is, even if they don't like them. So city council people get elected by smaller vote totals. There's less money in city council races than there are mayor's races, council president races, state senate races, and gubernatorial races statewide. So it's a series of maximizing the power, not in the people you trust, not in the people you like. I'm saying it again. Maximizing the locus of power, not in the people you trust, not in the people you like, but the people you have the most leverage over. So it's an assumptive logic that with us, there's no guarantee, there's no technocratic, no elite cadre of experts that can do community control. It is only through consistent agitation and application of pressure does the community ever have control of anything in this country, given what we know about the structure of white supremacy. So that's why we had the money be remitted to county governments and city governments. In the case of Baltimore City, we're an independent city here in Maryland, totally separate from our county, based upon the percentage of cannabis arrests. So you do a percentage from 2023 to 2003 to 2023. And the percentages of cannabis arrests are disproportionately aggregated in Baltimore City, Prince George's County, Baltimore County. Those are the three big ones. We do that because we know that given the current environment in the courts, using the population of Black and Latino people, who are the most of the people arrested, that would be subject to a legal challenge that at worst would delay the application of the bill for years, or at best would delay the application for years, and at worst lead to it being struck down by a conservative court system. So we're using the structure of what we know about the pattern of arrest to create, and again, it's not always just all Black people, because we know some Black people were more insulated from those street arrests. So using an actual proportionate allocation to where the arrest actually happened, and then making it so there has to be an ordinance of the city council or county council to determine how those funds are spent. So that passed in 2022. In 2023, we in Baltimore did our local ordinance, which is the Baltimore City Community Reparations Commission. So basically, it's one city council person and the council president appoints people to the commission. The commission is impaneled with the power to decide where the money goes. It's given the power to insulate the commission from executive overreach, because in Baltimore, statutorily, the mayor has the final authority about who gets appointed to the commissions. But we made it so that they have to either accept the city council's commission or reject that person in writing. So basically, you have this sort of public deterrent from the governor or from the mayor to veto city council applications for who the city council person wants to select in the commission, because that's just real politically messy. There's nothing I can do to take that power away statutorily, but I will make it so that we can prevent the executives from using their influence for stacking the council, and make it so that if the city council people actually have the power to appoint, that creates way more opportunity for bottom-up advocacy and agitation for diversity of experts with diversity of experiences in the human social service sector, in reparations theory. So we've actually been advocating council person by council person, giving them recommendations of people to appoint that we know live in their districts. So that process has been pretty successful. We don't have any final word. We're going to have final word probably in about a month who's actually on the commission, but they're going to be empowered to actually decide where Baltimore's chunk of the money go. Baltimore gets about a third of that statewide fund. And we're talking about a percentage of a percentage, so it gets really abstract. It doesn't feel good. It feels wonky. It feels technocratic. But because of the way that we structured the fund, not only do cannabis sales tax go in the fund. But when a medical cannabis company transitions to be a recreational cannabis company, they have to pay a fee for the right to get into that market first, because we know they're big players. We know they're mostly white. So what we said was that looking at other states, you have to make sure you charge them a fee for what they're always going to have, which is a first mover advantage. And all of those fees actually go into the community reinvestment fund. So the fund is going to be about $5 to $10 million a year from tax revenue, but we also have 20 million in startup capital for Baltimore City alone, just from those transition fees from medical to recreational cannabis. So it's all this intentional planning to create the context where, 5 million is not reparations. They're still locking people up for weed. So this violates the principle of non-repetition in the UN definition of reparations. But if you build the infrastructure and you build the political momentum behind the community of people that are working in this space, you set yourself up to be able to advocate for what we also put in this year: progressive taxation, capital gains tax, progressive income tax. And then where's that money go? If you don't have containers that can handle millions of dollars, you cannot redistribute hundreds of millions and billions of dollars equitably in a manner that produces community control. So our theory is that we build up these community-controlled community reinvestment reparations for war on drugs containers, and that creates the logical place to put the money when we do reparations for slavery, when we leverage against the foundations that made that money blockbusting Baltimore, when we look at the history of slavery in Maryland, when we look at progressive taxation, that builds the intermediary infrastructures that know how to incubate Black business, know how to incubate cooperatives, know how to incubate nonprofits that use liberatory methodologies and culturally competent methodologies. Because the existing intermediaries that can hold hundreds of million dollars, not only do they not know how to do that, they have an incentive to attack, ignore, or destroy the people that are doing that sort of community-based bottom-up work. Because if those people are doing the best work, they're a threat to their industry, because they actually don't know how to replicate and incubate those type of people and those type of institutions. So this is a very intentional effort of positional political warfare within the nonprofit space, within the public funding space, which we see as an extension of, a nonprofit system is the velvet glove to COINTELPRO's iron fist. And we know that. And we do everything we do knowing that, but building a beachhead within that battle through reparations for war on drugs.
Appreciate that. You said a lot there, and Renee, I'm happy to have you jump back in. I just wanted to ask real quick, and not even meaning. I thought of it as a joke, but I don't mean it as a joke. Why not just focus on legislation that got Black residents of Baltimore a check or a cut of the revenue, why all of this?
Yeah.
Incubation and all all
that's the debate, because people are going to say, now that you got the money, you should do a UBI pilot, and that's kind of what you would have to do if you'd have to do some sort of pilot for universal basic income. I'm not necessarily against those, but as you know better than anyone else, simply distributing the money based upon the ecosystem of institutions that are set up to take that money doesn't create the sort of circulation effects, doesn't create the political institutional machinery that can because we have to build political machinery that's permanent, that can continuously be a leverage to advocate for communities' changing interests. If you give them a check, I guess they could invest in a political campaign for someone elected to do that. But the reality is people have needs. People need food. People need to pay their bills, and that's where the money is going to go. That's not necessarily bad, but you need to build political machinery that has capacity to leverage consistent pressure on a variety of systems. It's very clear to me, I can't get into it all. You know better than I do, there's this obsession with Black wealth. And it's not about liberating Black people. It's about using internal colonial theory. There are zones within the American economy that are underperforming. And there are very few growth sectors left in the world, period. Africa is one with its burgeoning population, and Black America is one with its consistent economic underperformance dragging down all the other white assets around it. So you can't have an increase in value of real estate in Baltimore if Black Baltimore continues to be so disorganized or perceived as disorganized. So you have a lot of people who want to stabilize and create a perception of upward momentum in Black communities because they benefit from that. They control the real estate. There's $6 billion of investment planned within, I think, about 4 miles of Baltimore's Inner Harbor over the next 5, 6, 7 years. So a world where you're doing UBI in strategically placed neighborhoods is going to create the capacity where they can then shop at some of those new places that they're building downtown to feed the economic flywheel for the people that own all that. Otherwise, they're a drag on that. So whether it's Bank of America talking about investing billions in the Black communities through mostly loans, which means they need to get paid back with interest, or a UBI program, you have survival economics passing itself off as reparations. And you're dependent upon the political interest convergence with capital in order for you to continue to leverage those funds. Part of the value of cannabis sales is that people are not going to stop smoking weed. So it may only be 5 to 10 million per year, but it's every year consistently. And the idea is that if you build political machinery that consistently has funding, that means that as our interests evolve, what's going to be happening this 5 years is going to be different 5 years from now. But you have a political institution that's grounded, that can advocate for its own interests, that can be pressured to advocate for community interests. There's no belief that if you build it, it will serve community. We've seen every institution that we've built in some way or form get co-opted. It's inevitable, but it doesn't mean you stop building it. It means that you build more, you build better, and you build more strategically. So you have consistent political, Davon uses the term civilizational machinery. I like the term like political artillery because one of my favorite movies is Lawrence of Arabia. And what is now
Why,
Saudi Arabia.
Lawrence? Why, Lawrence?
I mean, that's like it because it talked about Pan-Arabism, right? Just the nature of trying to build your own country. And the British are like, if we give them artillery, they're independent, i.e. they can use it against us. So we can't give them artillery. So a lot of people are asking for everything they can get, but not trying to get the artillery themselves, because if we own the artillery, we can use it on the people who are actually hurting us, which is the people, not just the Republicans seeking to do austerity, but the Democrats doing gentrification. And so we need independent political artillery to have a chance to actually leverage against the people who are doing that diversity of harm to our community. Right now, what we have is people doing interest convergence with one chunk of the community: capital, real estate, finance, tech, med tech, basically being like, well, that's the only game in town. Then we're subject to all of the violence, all the epistemological limitations and political theory about what they want to do to us in our communities. We have no ability to fight that. So by building a political institution that's accountable to, that has a political check in terms of city council appointments, you can consistently refresh the accountability. You have a checkpoint to refresh the accountability as it slips, as the needs change. And that's political artillery that's permanently funded, that can then be used to be pushed back against the systems of capital that are inevitably going to attack our communities.
Can I just say, you have my head. I have so many thoughts, for real, so many thoughts. But so a couple of things. Actually, let me not do that. Multiple things at once. Jared, while I ask this first question, if you don't mind, because Lawrence literally said something that was touched upon in that conversation that Davon had, that you sent me the link to, and there's a short timestamp, and it's literally lock in step with what Lawrence was just talking about. And so while you pull that up, I just want Lawrence to understand that one of my greatest frustrations in all these conversations is the fact that people do not understand this differential between independent wealth of some Black people and how that literally has nothing to do with the broader Black community. And so when we have these conversations about organizing and why do you do things a certain way? And people point to, well, these people were able to do it, and the bootstraps and all these nonsensical conversations about how Black people are the problem in our own way of moving forward, and why I appreciate Jared's book so much, and trying to get people to understand how false this notion is of like Black wealth and catching up and all these things. So I really do appreciate that you brought this up. So there's my preemptive, and then I'll ask my actual question after you play it. Thank you.
Queen Mother Moore. I think what's important and why we focus on the tax revenues is because what we're clear about is that helping a handful of Black people become wealthy doesn't necessarily help the masses of Black people. And in many ways, those are folks that tend to be weaponized against Black folks. One of the considerations that we actually had in moving the legislation was that there were legislators from whom their conversation with us wanted to focus on the dispensaries and focus on, let's get a few of these individual Black people access to the capital to get the dispensaries. Now, one of the challenges they had, though, was that they didn't have a mass base, right? Folks that operate that way, their power comes from a lot of the backroom dealing, right? And when you don't have that, then you don't have much leverage. So in some ways, them coming to us was almost like a recognition that even though their endeavor was much more of a capitalist, integrationist kind of thrust, in terms of the ability for them to even deliver on that was limited, because you need a mass base in order to push past leadership that ultimately isn't going to prioritize a handful of Black people being able to get access to the industry.
I mean, that sold me. I was like, because we have to get away from, we really have to get away from this, in the individual aspect, the individualism aspect of all these things. And this is the battle. So let me explain what my conundrum is that we go through every time we have these conversations about politics and investing any time and energy into electoral politics, which is we are all conditioned to understand that most politicians serve no purpose, right? And that they do exactly what you all have discussed. They figure out the backroom deals. They figure out how to, earn money themselves or give money to people that they know, and all these things. And so people stop investing in the system, right? And they don't want to vote. They don't want to be bothered. It's done. And I respect people's decision to be like, I'm not voting. I'm not dealing with these people. Nothing that they do serves any purpose. I don't want to be bothered. However, the problem that creates is if all the people who actually care about the collective improvement of Black communities don't participate in the process, you are then leaving all the decisions in the hands of the people who already don't care about the collective improvement of the Black community. And it creates this never-ending cycle. And so my conundrum always is, how do we rectify that as, in the sense of community organizing, to get even this baseline understanding that you can hate the system all you want, right? But if we don't find a way to gain some kind of power, we're never going to get away from the same system that we hate that is currently oppressing us. So I don't know how to, I don't know how to make that shift so that something works. And I'm curious, like, as you all are looking at these things and having these conversations and making decisions about who you talk to and all these things, like how do you branch that gap between the system doesn't work, but you have to do something in order to fight the system that uses the system in some way, shape, or like this is my conundrum, Lawrence. I've been struggling for a long time.
The man's name, but he was a bank robber. I asked him why he robbed banks. He said that's where the money is. And that's how I feel about politics. It's like, why do you do politics? It's like, because that's
John Dillinger, fam. That's exactly. John Dillinger.
Exactly. So it's not about a romantic vision of civic engagement. Like, we haven't, with limited exceptions supporting Jill Carter, we haven't done a ton of like overt electoral politics. We kind of take it as if, like, no matter who's in there, they at least facially have to appear to be doing things for the community. The other thing you have to remember is that these people can't do their jobs. None of them can. They're understaffed. They can't read the bills. They are highly dependent upon think tanks and lobbyists to essentially write their bills for them. Now, I don't have to like a politician to find them useful. And I think that's part of where the emotional block is. It's like, I just can't emotionally attach my credibility knowing the violence these people perpetuate. And I understand that, especially at a federal level. But I think at the state and local level, there's so much possibility that has not been presented to our community in a way that they can find it emotionally and affectively satisfying. It just feels like work. And that feels like there's never going to be a perfect moment where it pays off. So we've had to accept that, we did the Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund. That's $10 million a year. We helped construct B City, which is a West Baltimore fund. That's $1 million a year. We're helping to construct the Reparations Fund. That's, $5 to $10 million a year. So to us, seeing people actually do programming, like we just had a Rites of Passage graduation in Baltimore. Rites of Passage was intentionally frozen out of foundation funding for decades in Baltimore because it was a threat to the youth development pipelines produced by the white nonprofit industrial complex. So we had to lean on people in institutions to get funding for actual institutionalized rites of passage to become a part of Baltimore's youth development ecosystem. And that's something that, again, has been 30 years, again, elders who have been kicked out of the space, who've been frozen, starved out of the space, who have died in poverty. So I see, even though it's not like a massive global revolution, just forcing them, because we have these pockets of money that are more accountable to pressure, forcing them to do something like support African-centered rites of passage as a very important and affectively satisfying extension of my ancestral obligation to honor the sacrifices that have been done for me to have what I've been given, to extend that work to future generations. Now, most people have not been in a place where they can experience local politics doing in something like that. They look at the protests with George Floyd and get frustrated, or they look at the Bernie movement and get frustrated. But the actual, not just momentum that so many people seek, but the actual victories that can materially change conditions for people, to me, are at state and local level that do not operate the scale of trillions, do not operate at the scale of the violence being done to us. But again, if you can invest in the long-term vision of building political artillery or civilizational machinery through strategic political engagement, then you begin to see a trajectory where we have the tools needed to push. We've got a $50 billion budget in the state of Maryland. We're not a poor state. So there's a lot more that can happen. We introduced a bill in the state house this year that would have generated $1 billion of tax revenue. And it all actually went to the Community Reparations Fund. We knew it wasn't going to pass. But this is the work of seeding the political space so that other demands can actually begin to percolate and be forced into the agenda. The problem is that it's political warfare. And most people didn't sign up for political warfare. They signed up because this stuff makes them mad, and they just have to do something that expiates that frustration and anger. And what I'm saying is we have to harness that frustration and anger to be strategically engaged with people who we know what they are. We know whose they are. Like, they're not ours. They're not funded by us. They're not accountable to us. But they don't know what they're doing. They might be evil. They're mostly ignorant. And mostly they need something they can sell. That's the biggest thing I realize, is that you don't have to believe anything that I believe to be useful to me. I give you something. I've started out. I've researched it. It covers your ass as a politician. And that's all you really need is CYA. That's not sexy, but that's real. And when you start talking about tens and hundreds of millions of dollars flowing, see what is essentially, that's how we got the bill passed. They had to do something that was called reparations. They didn't care what it was. They don't even know what it is probably to this day. They just know that we researched it, we've defended it, and it's better to agree with us than fight us. So you don't have to be a revolutionary to be useful to us. You just have to know we can hurt you, and we can touch you, we can make you look stupid, and there are people in your base who you trust to vote for you in primaries who see us as credible. So we make appeals to people who are going to vote in primaries, in these state house races that are decided by a few thousand votes. And they go to community meetings and they say, what's up with LBS? I heard they didn't like what you did. And that puts pressure on them, right? So it's one of those things where the consistent gaining of credibility amongst a broad, that's why we talk about having a base. It's not like fans. It's not like people who are like super fans of ours. They probably don't agree with most of our theory, but they understand we have a degree of credibility and they want to see their lawmakers accountable to the perspective that we produce. And the lawmakers know they have no good answer to why they don't want to do what we're doing, besides they just don't want to because it's more difficult, because they're scared. And we can leverage their fear and ignorance to be a tool for community. So I know that's not the cleanest answer, but the one thing I would have to say is, like, we have to recognize that our emotions are being weaponized against us, even in the revolutionary theory that we consume and how we are imbibing it. So if we are consistently seeking these cathartic moments of revolutionary catharsis, we are going to consistently gloss over, pass over the opportunities to manifest meaningful engagements to attack the political economy of anti-Blackness and capitalism in our communities every day. But we have to think that we are capable of engaging those realities, and we have to be willing to invest emotionally and affectively and spiritually in seeing that work is worth doing.
Whew. Can I just tell you, my mother right now is sitting and like, she can't wait to call me when this ends, just an FYI. 2 reasons. 1, because her initials are LBS and she's blown away. And 2, because you are literally saying all the things. And so I appreciate that. So I have
Peace to LBS.
I know, right? Did you have a question, Jared, or can I ask?
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Right.
Yeah.
So here's something that I'm super interested in as we discuss, like, as you just said, everything that you explained about working within the system and all those things. So I have 2 questions. 1, is there ever a time and space where LBS considers creating a politician to be a part of this, right? Because part of one of the conversations we always have, and I feel like it's something Daruba talks about, but Jared will tell me if I'm telling a straight up lie, is putting people in the position to make these decisions that have an effect on community control, right? And how that works. And then outside of that, I am also curious to know about this decision to not be a nonprofit in order to be able to work within these political spaces. So I know those are 2 actually very, very different questions, but I feel like the answer to the first one is short, where the answer to the second one
I think they're kind of the same question. So like I said, like, we've thought about it. The question is, what we've done, let me say what we've done. We've supported, limited sort of statements of support for, like, Jill Carter, because Jill Carter was running against the son-in-law of Martin O'Malley, who was propped up to run against her to basically kick her out of office in 2018. So we were very explicit about sort of Martin O'Malley as the white former mayor of Baltimore, former governor of Maryland, sort of seen as instigating the mass arrest policy. 777,000 illegal arrests in Baltimore over a course of like 10 years. And they basically astroturfed his son-in-law into a race in West Baltimore to kick out the daughter of Walter Carter, famous core civil rights, Black Power person who was our #1 champion in the legislature. So we were knocking doors, we were, handing out literature, because we understood, like, she's not someone that we have to hold accountable. She's a mentor that helped guide us in our theory of political engagement. So she represents a counterweight to the Democratic establishment, both in terms of her fundraising base and her politics, which are very useful in the political sphere. Now, beyond her, what it takes to build out a political fundraising base, because again, you have to fund these people to make them accountable to you. They can, of course, just take your money and not be accountable to you. And then you have to have the type of people who give the money what are their interests? They may not all be revolutionary interests for the people who give $1, $2, $3, $4, $5,000 to a political candidate. So this is to say, like, we have not figured all of that out yet. But the biggest thing that we've done is something I think I've heard Daruba and others say: we treat the issue like it is the candidate. So we're running campaigns around the issues that force all of the candidates to respond to the issue in the campaign. So with that, not being a nonprofit allows us to, I mean, you can do consciousness raising, you can be on the Hill sort of educating lawmakers as a nonprofit, but there is a politics to the space that freezes people out because there's always a fear of your funding being pulled. Like, you know, some of the work we're doing with violence prevention is directly criticizing like very, very prominent people in the violence prevention space who are basically trying to become the new gatekeepers for the money that should be going to Black grassroots organizations. If we were a nonprofit, it would literally be like, you a grantee of ours, you can't criticize another grantee like that, and we can just pull your funding, right? But we might work a contract with a foundation that says we're going to do a report about why we're criticizing this gatekeeping institution. And once that report's over, we're done. Like, our relationship is over. So we've intentionally built like a grassroots funding model. We have about 400 people that give us money every month. You know, then we have each individual person has area of expertise. Mine is drug policy, things like that. And we all do different consulting gigs with foundations, with nonprofits, with, you know, we do webinars, we do trainings, and that basically pays for our salaries so that when we go to Annapolis, most people who are nonprofits, a foundation or someone else cooks up a bill and they pay people to push their bill. We write our own bills and we pay ourselves so that we can afford the time to spend in Annapolis pushing these bills independent of what anybody else wants. And I think that's an innovation we've made in the space that allows us to, again, get around the limitations of them not funding cannabis advocacy on the front end. Or, you know, they want to push drug decriminalization in Maryland. And we were like, well, I need to do some, we're doing other stuff, but also I need to research this more. And the more I researched it, it's like, yeah, I was never going to support the bill you wanted me to push for you, because that bill was not going to address the community's concerns about addiction and drug decriminalization. So that having the freedom to not just not be tied to the grants, it's a mentality. And the mentality is, you know, I am an intellectual person who's going to himself figure this out. Like, I don't need to hop on a moving train. I don't need to follow what's on Twitter. I don't have to have an opinion on that. Like, I have to generate my own market, which means I have to have a degree of expertise that is so precise and valuable, other institutions can't not value it, because then I don't eat, you know, and it doesn't mean I have to compromise what I do. In fact, it's the opposite. I have to be extremely rigorous and precise about the way that I'm pursuing my lines of work, because I'm trying to make it so that when people are like, you know, there are people doing work in Baltimore who, like, you know, the credibility we have, the skill sets we have, the research base we have, you know, people actually need the work that we do. So it is a bit precarious because we don't get like a solid, you know, yearly influx of money that we didn't dole out. But year over year, we build enough credibility with key institutions that we are then able to be an indispensable part of the work that they do, so that we can do the community engagement, we can do the research, we can do the trainings they need to get work done. So that makes us accountable to the people in the community that we serve, that are largely, you know, Black folks in independent Black institutions and Black folks in sort of larger institutions who are trying to push those institutions to meet the needs of the community. They oftentimes have a feeling of what's wrong, but they don't have a theory or a precise solution. And it's our job to help them cook those things up, you know? So it's one of those things where, you know, we've taught classes, workshops on this. It's something I would love to talk about more, but, you know, I'm sure we have a lot of other things to talk about. But the social entrepreneurship model we use, I think, has been indispensable to not just the freedom materially, but we have a mindset about how we do our work because we have to.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, I mean, it sounds good. It's hard to argue that. So I do have one more follow-up question. Jerry, I don't know if you have questions also. So
I mean, yeah, but By all
Just
means,
real
go
quick,
ahead. No rush. Yeah.
it's somewhat connected, which is how, so in all of these things and working with this framework, how does LBS prevent itself from falling into the co-opting trap? Like how do you as an organization remain steadfast, right? And don't, like, I actually love that you're not a nonprofit, because I agree. I feel like sometimes you're trapped by whoever is giving you the money. But how do you make sure that you don't fall off the path that you're on and get co-opted? This is my curiosity as I'm listening to you talk. So
Yeah, well, I mean, part of it is that, I mean, honestly, like when we were younger, if people in Baltimore were smart, they would have just given us a bag when we were like 22, 23. But they didn't do that. So like we had to have done this like entrepreneurial self-generative model. Not that we have took that bag, but it's like we had to do this because the space was so adamant about freezing folks like us out. And so people aren't just going to throw money at us to like serve as appendages to that institution, because what we do doesn't serve their institutions. Like, we have become experts at sort of framing why we have to shift power and resources within the nonprofit industrial complex and public funding spaces. Some people want to appear to do that, but actually doing that would be a threat to the people that either fund their foundations or fund their campaigns. So there's a certain level of baseline, like how we've built our expertise in a way that is in some ways antagonistic to many of the structures of power. Now, I mean, there are some folks, I mean, like, I guess, the Black bourgeoisie could co-opt this message, and they tried to do pieces of it. But they honestly don't have the money to like consistently pay us. But, just sort of going beyond the ticky-tacky stuff. I mean, I think part of it is like, I mean, I've been through an African Center Rites of Passage program as an adult. We have informal groups of mentors that we all collaborate with, that we share the work with, that hold us accountable. A big part of the work we do and our model is we have to embed ourselves in community. We have to see what the needs in community are. We then do an evaluation of how our skill set overlaps with the needs in community. And it is those needs in community that then hold us accountable. So if I'm talking about addiction and I'm talking about employment, and then people are like, yeah, we don't need employment. What we need is sort of, ways of expanding access to particular types of treatment that are culturally competent and that reframe how people relate to money. Because money is actually one of the biggest triggers for relapse for addiction. So you can't just think about employment without changing people's relationship to money first. So it's like, okay, so I can't do that, just focus on that thing I thought was the solution. I have to be animated by the people in the space, because the people in the space who speak highly of us, they're the people who are talking to politicians, who politicians are talking to. And people who are credibly situated in the human social service space, in the education space, in the violence prevention space, them saying, we're working with LBS. LBS has said this. What's your relationship to that? Them speaking credibly about us is how we keep our credibility to have leverage over the people in the policy space to do the work we do politically. So it's like, this whole flywheel thing, whatever you want to call it, it's a system. Like it was created organically, but it is nonetheless systematic, where it is intentionally engaging with the needs of people on the ground that hold us accountable to build a political solution that works backwards from their needs to the scale of the problem. Most people are doing it the other way around, where they say, where's the money at? How do I force that money to go to where I see the needs are? And the structures of power that control that money are going to create a solution that meets their needs. That's not going to be the needs of the community. Like, we figured out how to do the opposite as rigorously as we can, where, the needs of community, we then work backwards to how do I create a institutional or political solution that can actually address those needs, and then how do I scale that up? So it's one of those things where if the community doesn't like it, the model fails. If the community doesn't like it, the theory fails. If the community doesn't like it, they don't speak credibly about us in these spaces that gives us the leverage we need to make people feel like they got to work with us, to make people feel like they got to read our reports, to make people feel like they have to hire us to do research and contracting. So I think that really has created a structural system where we have to continuously check in with our partners, continuously be where they are at. We talk about Black civil society, in the context of like Afro-pessimism, civil society being anti-Black. It is, but there's also a Black civil society that has its own systems, its own mechanisms of social life within that social desk. And we've embedded ourselves within that space and try to learn the lessons that folks have there and enforce those lessons into the world of people who believe we are socially dead, and force them to engage with the expertise and the context of the reality that's produced in those spaces. So I think it's one of those things where, again, it's just kind of occurred organically. But if those folks don't speak credibly about us, there is no LBS. So there's no world in which we can't be accountable to them.
Right on. No, thank you very much. There was a question that I think was going back to what I was attempting to show and ask you more about a minute ago regarding the revenue in Maryland. The comptroller of Maryland a little while ago tweeted this in the end of March, and I'm wondering if you can just help clarify what we're looking at here. Are you able to see what I've pulled up?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
we've officially hit the math alert. So everybody, please be willing to work with me, because I have dyslexia. Dyscalculia is part of that. So that actually deterred me from working with numbers for a long time. But I've had to get over that because the needs are so great. So we've worked with the comptroller. She's been actually pretty helpful in working with us on this issue. So Maryland has one of the lowest cannabis tax rates in the country. We have a 6% regular sales tax. We say we have a 9% cannabis tax. That's not true. We actually have a 3% cannabis tax because cannabis sales are at a 9% tax, which is only 3% more than our original 6% sales tax. However, all of that tax money goes into a separate pot. None of it goes into the general fund. So, cannabis is taxed at 9%. Maryland generates around, we're projected to generate around, $500 million to $750 million in tax revenue. Let's just round it up to 10% for ease in people's brains. At $500 million in cannabis sales at a 10% tax rate, that's only $500 million for the whole state. We're leaving hundreds of millions of dollars on the table with our low tax rate. Now, the reason they're doing it is because they're concerned about the businesses. They're like, well, if you tax cannabis too high, they go to the black market. Look what they're doing in California. Look what they're doing in Washington. People are sticking with their weed person rather than buying from dispensaries. Washington taxes cannabis at like 35%. So I keep telling these folks, like,
wow,
we can do 15% and be fine. Oregon, Illinois does 30%, and they have $100 million in just their cannabis reparations fund.
And forgive me for interrupting, but I just want to ask: have you looked into those claims? Is it true that because I know corporations claim this all the time, but is it actually true that if dispensaries tax, if the state taxes it more, businesses will be negatively impacted? Will people really go back to the? It is very
marginal, and it only really kicks in at around 25% tax rate. They've done actual statistical evaluations about the tax rate to black market ratio. What really freaked them out was New York. New York had great intentions with their tax bill or with their cannabis legalization bill. They actually tried to get nonprofits to run the dispensaries, like nonprofits doing good work in community, to actually have a stream of revenue to fund the nonprofits, which I think was laudable. They've been extremely slow at getting recreational dispensaries off the ground. So every tienda and bodega in New York have like Delta 8, gummies and illegal cannabis gummies. And that just freaked them out. And the corporate folks use that threat of New York City to be like, if you don't give the lowest tax rate possible and just make it as easy as possible for us to open up these dispensaries, the black market's going to come in and it's going to destroy your industry. Right. And they're also afraid of the cartels, like, quote unquote, flooding the zone with cheap cannabis to protect their profits. It's ridiculous stuff. Like, it's only a little bit of knowledge about that in California. And California has a unique 100-year history of cannabis culture. So they were basically shook. But they basically used it as a way to protect small black businesses. Because they were like, if we increase the tax rate at all, we decrease the demand at all, who's going to be hurt most by that deflated demand? It's the small black business person. So they basically used rhetoric of protecting Black business to give us the lowest cannabis tax rate in the country, right? I know, I think it's kind of a
Wow.
lot, but that's what happened. And that's just how powerful, because they couldn't do the minority set-asides. So what they did was give us the lowest cannabis tax. So the whole state of Maryland's only going to have like $50 million in cannabis tax revenue, period, which is insane, right? But again, 35% of that's 15 million. 30% of 15 million is, a little bit more than 5 million. But that's projected to increase because as industries mature, they begin to sell more cannabis. Also, like I said, we have the conversion fees. So like I said, when medicinal dispensaries transition to recreational, we charge them as a state the right to do that because it's a huge advantage. And the racism and preference in the medicinal space was horrible. But we at least get to charge them for that first mover advantage, and all of that money goes into the reparations fund. So that's about $60 million projected. Baltimore City gets $20 million from that alone. So that's why I say it's going to end up for Baltimore City alone being 5 to 10 million per year on top of the 20 million we got from the conversion fee. So that's the numbers we're working with. Now, it's not just Baltimore City. So if you're watching this in Montgomery County, we actually worked with Crystal Orieta in Baltimore County, and they introduced a reparations commission bill very similar to ours. They didn't use the word reparations, but they've also essentially mirrored our model. So their money will also be in a container appointed by county council people with the express commitment to do reparative work for the war on drugs. So if you are in PG and you know county council people or people with pull, they need good people on that commission, right? So please engage there. Same thing with Baltimore County. Montgomery County has also passed legislation mirroring our reparations commission in Baltimore City, and we're trying to push that in Baltimore County as well. So in every locality, that spray of funds is going to look a little bit different, but it's Baltimore City. Second, it's actually Baltimore County, which was surprising. I thought it would be PG in terms of the percentage of cannabis arrests. So, of that 15 million, 20 million-ish chunk that goes to the reparations fund, like a third goes to Baltimore, but like 20% goes to Baltimore County, like 18% goes to PG, and like I think 15% goes to Montgomery County, right? So every state's going to get not just that chunk of yearly cannabis taxation money, but also a chunk of the conversion fees, that big tranche of money that comes from medicinal transition to recreational. And finally, we are going to go to the state of Maryland. Maryland's going to do, the Black Caucus has requested a comprehensive evaluation of what reparations will look like in Maryland. So not just reparations for the war on drugs, the Black Caucus wants to put in a bill and do advocacy for reparations more broadly. And so we're going to bring our expertise to them. Delegate Elsie McCaskill is in Baltimore County. She's been empowered to lead the sort of exploratory work on that. And part of the thing we're going to do is request an increase in the cannabis tax to be able to fund reparative work for the war on drugs. And that's not to ignore the cost to consumers, but this is the difference between $100 in cannabis cost and $109 with tax versus $115 with tax. It's not a lot of money to the consumer, but that would almost double the amount of money in our cannabis reparations fund, just changing it from 9 to 15%.
So two things just for clarification, and then I'm happy, Renee, for you, or we can go to chat questions. So one, when I'm looking at, I just want to clarify that I'm seeing this correctly. 50% of all the revenue in the state of Maryland is going going to the state.
That's to fund like the blueprint for education.
Okay.
That's to fund that's how it was framed. It's framed as the blueprint's going to be super costly. We're just going to put it in a general fund, assuming it's probably going to go to stuff like the blueprint for education.
Okay, because so the second part of my question was how then the money that comes and is sprinkled sort of all over the state, how does it end up reaching working class Black people? How do they feel this impact? And then is this going to, because it's starting to feel like despite all of, like I'm worried that despite all your good work, this is going to turn into another version of what we used to hear about the lottery or gambling revenue. It's going to
That's an
help
excellent question.
education. It's gonna help with rehabilitation. It's gonna
Yeah.
and you know, so
Exactly. So
yeah.
to address that, that's actually a great point. We have very few restrictions on what the funds can be spent on, because part of the thing people ask is, what's it going to be spent on? And my answer is, well, if I told you, that wouldn't be reparations. It has to be up to the people in the community who are harmed to determine what that money gets spent on. So we have to leave it open to what they can spend it on. But here's what they can't do. They cannot give it to police, and they cannot use this money to trade off with already allocated funds. That's what they did with the lottery. They did, the old shell game, which is like, well, I already have 70 million allocated for education. I got this lottery money, but now I'm just going to do 35 million. And I'm just going to use the 35 million from lottery money to equal 70 million.
Wow.
Got him, right? So we actually said you can't do that. You can't play that shell game. Now, this is why we've consistently said there's no guarantee this goes to working class Black people. I can't guarantee that. What I can say is that of all the options we've evaluated, having the reparations commission model with the point of inflection, the point of political inflection being city council people, gives us the greatest ability to appoint commissioners who have a theory that's amenable to doing the sorts of investment that will touch working class Black and brown people. So, for example, one of the biggest limitations is just traditional grant making programs. They require like 3 years of audited financial statements. They require, evidence-based evaluations of whatever you're doing, the use of evidence-based best practices. And if you're not going to do that, you have to figure out, how am I going to evaluate the program? Who am I going to help do the institutional capacity building? Like the Baltimore City Church and Youth Fund is a good example of this. We give money to barbershops to do barbering summer camps. We give money to, small organizations to take kids on scouting trips, like the Roots of Scouting here in Baltimore. These people haven't thought about things like insurance. You got to have insurance to get government money. So you need to build out the capacity of an institution that can go to a barbershop and actually be willing to work with the type of people that run barbershops, to do insurance, to do tracking of funds, to do accounting. This is not to say this is going to be easy or fun or happy. I'd say public money is probably the worst way to get Black people money, except for every other way to get Black people money, right? So it's one of those things where our ability to leverage the vote and our ability to leverage these particular points of inflection create the possibility where we're adamant that we're going to get people on our Baltimore City Reparations Council that have experience doing exactly that. But it is up to a local organizing effort to put pressure on city council people to appoint people who have the type of experience doing the type of work that community values. And last thing I'll say is that is an incredibly severe point of contestation within community. Because however you define community, there are lots of people who value very, very different ways of dispersing this type of money. Some people want it to be like, more diverse, smaller investments for things that, community block parties, art installations. People want to do a dance performance. Some people want to do that sort of thing. Some people want to do something like, look, it's not a lot of money, but what if we look at some community ownership, some cooperative housing ownership, some investing in job creation pipelines? Like, there is no illusion in my mind actually doing this work or being adjacent to this work for years now, that this is not an intense point of political contestation, and I think political contestation within our community. But the point is, we have the space to fight that out amongst ourselves. We are not even given the space to have that political contestation as to what it looks like and what it feels like for us to get investment in our community, because we're not even in a position where the institutions with the money have the capacity to hold that conversation, right? So I think that the best version of these reparations commissions is that they are a container for us to work out conflicting and contrasting community visions of how investment should look, feel, and what it should produce. I have my own personal visions, but again, it has some say, but I couldn't direct this money to who I wanted to if I tried, because we've designed it so we don't, even though we designed the bill, we don't have the ability to leverage a particular node of power to force investment to go anywhere. When you have a commission like this, it's intense, it's chaos. There's a type of chaos that I think reflects the diversity of views in our communities when it's done well, right? And it doesn't mean that's what it's going to be. But if it is intentionally framed as bringing that diversity to the table, that can be a contestation where many people are going to say war on drugs. The formerly incarcerated have to be centered and prioritized. But other people, it's like, no, that leadership's a victimhood. We have to think about this more collectively in terms of a community-wide analysis of where the investment should go. I think both those perspectives are legitimate. I think they would look at very different ways of investing that money if you have those different perspectives. And I welcome that. It's not going to look good. People are going to scream and curse and accuse each other of being everything but a child of God. And when white people see that, they freak out. They say, well, black people can't have money because that's what they do when they get it. When some of our people see that, they freak out. They say, well, black people can't have money because that's what they do when they get it. Well, I know if that's inevitable. Nothing I can do can stop that. But I'm arguing that that is a process of how a oppressed, traumatized people work out a vision of liberation for themselves. And I'm going to build the political power to preserve that space for us to do that with each other.
Can I ask a quick question about the commission? Because I'm curious, and I know it's still, I know the mayor has like said he's moving forward and it's going to happen and all the things. Is there space if someone is put up to the commission for the community to say, oh, hell no, that person can't, like that person can't be there?
That's one of the values of having the commission model. If you appoint someone in Baltimore City, at least, I'll speak for Baltimore City, to an executive nomination, there has to be a public hearing where they accept public testimony. So again, it's not perfect, but it's at least a public, clearly verified space where individual people from community can have commentary either for or against someone who's being lifted up. So I think that was an important reason why we did this the way we did it. Because if you look at Illinois doesn't really have that. They have it all aggregated in the state government. They basically just have, they use poverty, not drug arrests, as the metric for where the money goes. There are 90% white towns getting money from the War on Drugs Reparations Fund. It's basically just like a traditional grant program where the big, well-established nonprofits get a lot of the money, and their big change to that was giving it more to churches in the second round. And, you know, one can see the value in a faith-based approach. They do a lot of work, but it's also, those folks are highly tied to the Democratic Party. You know, and they may not have the diversity of approaches that the community would actually want to see in what they do with their work. So it was very important for us to have a model that allowed for a space of community contestation. And this model does allow that.
Right on. There's probably plenty more to be said, obviously, and raise this question, but my list is gone. Renee, are you good?
I do. I have one
chat?
more.
Yeah,
go ahead.
But
we can go to the chat. So chat, while we're going through this piece of my last bit, if you have questions for Lawrence, drop it in now. And we do need to, we did get some, we got some dollars that we should highlight and say thank you for. So this is, now my question is going all the way back, and I trapped Davon into answering this question too. So I'm curious about your answer. So stepping all the way back to when you all first decide, okay, this is the thing that we're going to do, right? Can you talk me through that initial process? Because what I find in organizing spaces and with organizers is that starting spot is tricky, right? Like, do you start with an idea, or do you start with a question and then formulate your idea based on the data that you get from the question? And since you're a researcher, I feel like your answer to this is going to be like monumental for me because it's something that I've been trying to lock down whenever we talk to people in different spaces. Because one of the things I really want people to understand is if you're in a community that is trying to change something, what is your starting point? Like, how do you make the decision about what happens first and moving forward from there?
So I would defer to Davon's answer because, they were doing community or campus organizing at Towson while debating. So I think that was an important reality for them. Like, I went to school on the West Coast. Like I said, I did more traditional debate that was more like traditional think tank style debate and also critical theory debate. But they were doing community organizing because they had to on campus because that's part of how they got money for the debate team. So in terms of the theory practice dichotomy, it wasn't possible for them because they literally had to go to like the student government and had the student government give them funds to travel to debate tournaments, right? So they were doing things like organizing the Black Student Union. Davon was on the student government at Towson. Adam had a column in the student newspaper, the Tower Light. Deverick was the leader of the Black Student Union. Deverick Murray, one of the co-founders of LBS. He's no longer working with us, but shout out to Devrock. He was also like a hip hop person, so he would be leading, some of the hip hop stuff with the BSU. Then they also formed an alternative, a new student group on campus called Leaves Our Beautiful Struggles. That's where it started on campus as like a more socially engaged Black community organization on campus at Towson. So I think to get to your question, one of the things that I've always seen is important to how we do our work. And part of it is like there is a theoretical component to it, like the Ella Baker model of organizing, which says that you could kind of go into community, see who the people who have juice are, give them a pitch as to whatever you're pushing, how it addresses some of their needs, and then brings them on board with what you're doing. Use sort of confrontational and attention-grabbing tactics to leverage the media, and find ways to then use that leverage to do a brokered negotiation with whoever you empower to do that negotiation. I think it's not purely Alinsky, but I think that's a more Alinsky-inflected model of organizing. I think for us, a more Ella Baker inflected model of organizing says that people, part of it is like how you relate to, I hate using this term, but like class consciousness, double consciousness, whatever. It's our theory that even though people are subjected to propaganda, and though they are subjected to double consciousness, they have some evaluation of what their needs are. And people are always already organizing to meet some of their needs, if imperfectly, or if in a limited political scope. So one of the biggest things that I've seen or I try to do with my research work is see where people are, see what they're already doing, see how the skills we have can add to something that's already happening, and then increase the level of abstraction in terms of, not abstraction, but increase the level of political import in terms of the demand for resources, increase the level of political acuteness in terms of the attack on the political establishment that's causing the problem, and increase the level of theoretical clarity, but of the demand that already exists. So you're just being useful to the people that are already doing stuff. And part of it is to trust that those people who may not be radicals, who may not be Pan-Africanists, who may not be revolutionaries, will find that work useful, even if they can't always all the way follow all the places that you're going with it. So I think, part of, let's just say, for example, one of our first big things we did as an organization was stop the construction of a youth jail. They wanted to build a $100 million facility for youth charged as adults in Baltimore City. So part of what we did was, we looked at the people who were in our networks, looked at the people who value what we did in debate, who were mentors of ours. And part of what they were saying was like, look, we don't like some of the advocates in this coalition, not because we don't support the call, but because like they're using youth, Black youth, as white nonprofit organizers as a visual rhetorical battering ram to get more money into their pipelines to do work for their nonprofits. So it's really just these people funding themselves. That's not to say the call isn't good to stop the jail, but we had to be willing to say, look, these people may not all the way be perfect, but their demand for Black grassroots investment is something that we are going to add to the conversation in terms of why we have to stop the youth jail. Because there are lots of people who see the demand to stop the jail and just say, well, what about accountability? What about what we do with kids when they bad, which is whatever bad, which is what we're having the conversation today. And it's like, look, we need to build an ecosystem of institutions that are community controlled so that we can choose for ourselves what we do with our kids. And that actually was met with great pushback from the white folks in the coalition. But it was the only way that we were not only going to have fidelity to our model, but that we're going to win over working class Black folk who are not going to have an answer to the question of youth justice without an understanding of accountability. And if you don't give them an understanding of accountability that is culturally specific, what they're going to default to is prison, right? So being willing to work with our people, not judge them at face value, that they just hate kids and want to lock them up, that they have legitimate concerns that may go beyond like where like the logical theory, like good, bad dichotomy would take you, and organize with our people to get to a demand that I think centers the building out of a community youth justice ecosystem that has Black people controlling the flows of money and the flows of who works with youth. And that's a lot of what we have as the seeds of our violence prevention ecosystem in Baltimore that is now bearing fruit. And, you know, I think part of it is that consistent advocacy, people seeing you year after year after year, working with you. And part of it is like, that's hard because Black elders have been traumatized. Black people have been traumatized by well-meaning, leftist, revolutionary sounding people who oftentimes are not there for the long haul, who oftentimes will run away from them, you know, if things get hard. You know, it's like, we joke about it, but it's like, if you haven't been cursed out by like a certain number of grandmothers in Baltimore City, you're not an organizer. But we have an environment where that level of accountability to the actual, and again, no one should be subjected to violence like it's okay, but you're dealing with traumatized people that are facing genocidal conditions. It's irrational to expect them to greet you with open arms, and irrational to expect them to not air to you like the level of trauma that they're facing, you know. And if you have to be willing to work through that, and it's very difficult, and it's not always been equally distributed in terms of how men are treated, how women are treated, how LGBTQ people are treated within those spaces with elders. And it's diverse, it's not monolithic in any way, shape, or form. But it's a belief that working with community and viewing the ways in which they presented their issues as having the seeds of revolutionary potential worth investing in, so many of us have been taught that the opposite is true, that they have been so misled, that they are so downtrodden, that they must be brought back into the flow of history through the immortal science of Marxism-Leninism, or they must be brought back into the unifying grasp of a Pan-Africanist revolutionary frame. I think the seeds of that are always already embedded.
Yeah, I think you knocked your mic. You got so amped. Now you're muted. Unmute when you come back. Yeah.
And real quick, and I want you to finish that thought, Lawrence, when you get yourself settled. Don't worry, no worries, no rush. But also, if you could just very quickly explain, when you say going into the community to find what people are already doing, what that looks like. Like, what is that? Is that like talking to people? Is that searching to see like what people are posting? Is that like just out of my own curiosity? Yep, we got you back. Okay. But don't forget to finish your thought before you answer.
No, it's like, I honestly have a hard time understanding that question, because I mean, part of it is our filter bubbles. Part of it is we're living in an algorithmically distorted world. Part of it is that many of us have been traumatized by our experience with community. You have to make an intentional effort to enter into the flows of information that will tell you the types of spaces where Black civil society is manifesting itself. And these are not always easy places to find. So, again, I'll just use the example that I know. We Are Us is a Black-led grassroots community violence intervention group. They do like lots of talks, lots of forums, lots of community walks. But most of these people, they may have Facebook, but if you don't know to look for them, if you don't turn, like, not even just follow them, you have to like prefer them in your timeline, because no one's engaging with their stuff. And they may not have an email listserv. So there are certain people who are like I don't want to call them busybodies, but there are certain people who have, if you go to like community forums, neighborhood association meetings, you look at, big convenings held by the NAACP and the Urban League, there are going to be certain people that keep popping up. And that's not to say that any of those spaces are perfect. It took us years and years and years to develop our social networks. So part of it is, people move for school. People have precarious housing. Our model really does prefer being embedded in a particular place for the long term. And that's not possible with everybody. We're from here, so we have the advantage of just having some organic social networks in terms of our family and like church and school. But I think it is really continuously putting yourself into places where you can be exposed to hear the work people are doing and not automatically judging the work that they're doing, right? So whether it's seeing who shows up to testify, whether it's like, just like going to community forums and see not just who's on the panel, but who speaks up, and then following their organization. If they have an email listserv, sign up for it, and putting yourself in a position where you're going to be in some meetings that are, not politically where you want to be. They're not revolutionary, but you have to believe there's an articulation of a grievance there that reflects the core of the problem you're trying to solve. And we believe that what we've done in Baltimore is that we recognize that where we're going manifests addressing the needs so many people have, that people are finding valuable the tools we bring to them. And that doesn't mean sometimes they say that's stupid, don't do that. And being willing to see that not in the spirit of a personal attack, but in the spirit of they have a grassroots vernacular understanding of what they want and what they need, and what you're offering may not be what they need at the time. It doesn't mean that you never sever an alliance. It doesn't mean that you subject yourself to perpetual abuse. We've had people be toxic and separate us from very, very, very valuable, beloved relationships because of that personal animus and trauma they faced. So it's not an easy road. It's not an easy methodology. Like what we're doing is like the hard mode of organizing in a lot of ways. But it allowed us to be successful pushing the engines of Black civil society that have, and many of your people in chat I know feel this way, that have been engines of our oppression. There are also impulses and abilities to turn those institutions towards engines that can build nodes that can be liberatory. They're not in themselves magically transformed. They are diunital. They're not dichotomous. They are both part of the establishment and manifesting a political demand that exceeds what that establishment can accommodate. And what we've done is we've given space to that latent desire amongst so many working class Black people. But all you see is the stuff when they sell out. All you see is election time. All you see is them standing next to the politician who you hate. You have to be able to see more than that.
That you actually answered that perfectly. I know you went into it thinking like you weren't sure, but, and I think what you said was really important about being embedded in the community. Like I live close to Newark, but I don't live in Newark, right? And so a lot of times when I do things and I hear people say, well, we should do this in Newark, I'm like, but you don't live in Newark, right? Like I don't live in Newark, so I'm not about to go into Newark and tell people in Newark what they should be doing in Newark because I don't live there. And I think that's an important, and that's, you actually answered and said exactly what I hoped you would say, because that was my inclination, is that you have to be embedded within a community. You have to be participating in the things that are happening in that community in order to gauge what the community is actually talking about. And you cannot do that from outside of that community. It just simply, it doesn't work the same.
Yeah, and I would say that people will say that that's a compromise, I think. And maybe it is, I don't know. To us, Pan-Africanism is not a theory, it's an objective, right? So our goal is to achieve the objective and push whatever vehicles we believe can be pushed towards a more liberatory Pan-Africanist framework. But we don't agree completely with almost anybody we work with. And I think part of it is that people have been socialized in especially academic spaces where those minute points of disagreement, you have a professional incentive to weaponize them. Or people have been so traumatized and are so fearful that oftentimes they default to weaponizing them, right? Because, the people who curse me out one day, like usually 2 weeks later, it's all love. And I think part of that is just we are very traumatized people. So experiencing that moment of frustration is not the entirety of what they feel about you, But if they know you're consistent, you can work through some of the differences. Like, housing is extremely complex. Cooperatives, land banks, eminent domain. It's extremely complex. It's almost impossible to have anybody agree on anything when it comes to housing, right? But we are engaging in that space in a spirit of learning, in a spirit of what can we do that can meet enough of all of our demands that pushes in a direction that we can agree with. Because that's coming from Baltimore. Like I said, $6 billion in construction for downtown over the next 5 years. I mean, part of me thinks they're going to put the 2028 DNC in Baltimore and then do the ribbon cutting on the bridge. Baltimore's open for business or something like that. It's good. They've been trying for years, and I think that it's really coming this time. But that means we're going to have to work with people who we probably don't all the way agree with in terms of not just politics, but in terms of what their political relationships are. Because, there are people who are, tied to development in weird ways, but they may have a good idea. Or they may have good intentions, but not know the entirety of the limitations of their approach. So part of it is being willing to consistently work through those differences. And last thing I'll say, that happens because we're not on a deadline for a grant. If you're on a deadline for a grant, you got to produce something by the end of the year. You got to say you passed something. You got to say you stopped something. And part of it is that's the tacit violence of the nonprofit industrial complex, forcing us into competition with each other. So if somebody comes out on the opposite side of my bill, I usually don't care, to be honest with you, because of course they would. It's my job to persuade them better. But if I have to deliver a grant where I have to say I passed something to get a grant for next year, that changes really, really fast. And I don't know that's not my life. I don't know that pressure, but I know that's part of it. Part of it is we're in such a competitive advocacy funding environment that what could be things that would otherwise be worked out and conflicts that would otherwise function within a political personal contestation and development become so antagonistic because Baltimore philanthropy has functioned like the Highlander. That can only be one. That could be one established, credible Black organization on a particular issue that has the plug, that has the juice. Everybody else bend the knee to them. And that's been a primary tool of our social disorganization and internecine conflict within Baltimore for 4 or 5 decades now. So one of the biggest things that we've done is by not being a nonprofit, we've taken ourselves out of competition with a lot of those people. So we can kind of serve as somewhat of a mediating intermediary force within those internecine conflicts.
Sort of similar to the question, we had a question here, and Kayla came back and may be thinking you sort of answered it, but what is the process like collaborating with community-based mental behavioral health orgs when their perspective around root causes is usually pretty flawed? In other words, does being held accountable by potentially methodologically flawed orgs sometimes create some tension? If so, how is that navigated?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
I'll use the example of addiction. Drug policy. We started with cannabis, but Baltimore has one of the highest per capita overdose death rate in the country. So I've begun to work more in the addiction space. Again, not funded. We did a report on decrim. That was a contract that we did. But it's not like this work is funded. It's just because we got to do something. But the methodological practices in the space, none of them are perfect. So part of it is I try to have a degree of equanimity. I don't have a perfect methodology for anything I do, except maybe winning high school debate rounds. I got really good at helping kids win high school debate rounds. I'm really good at that. But everything else, I'm just figuring stuff out like everybody else, right? But I think a good example of this is 12-step. 12-step, I started off being socialized by harm reduction people to be very critical of 12-step. And it is white, evangelical, Christian ideology at its heart. But it's not just that. And when it's in the hands of African people, it's not just that. It is communal, it's spiritual, and it's free. So there are communities of Black African people who are trying to pull the parts of 12-step that are worth investing in and manifesting, even though it can oftentimes blame the victim. It can oftentimes frame out structural conditions for the causes of addiction. In the hands of African people, I've seen it be more than that. I've seen it actually mirror what I've researched and seen as African-centered traditional healers. When they talk about it, they talk about it as spirit possession. They talk about it as being cursed. And they can talk about it through the lens of violent, oppressive forces pushing that curse into us. So there is space even within the spiritual, concept of addiction that many secular, evidence-based researchers don't like, for elements of African-centered healing methodology to work themselves. Part of it also is recognizing that it doesn't matter what I think. If it works for them, then I have to take it seriously. And if it is part of the space that they've chosen to manifest their contestation as African people, then I have to figure out how what I can bring them to a different version of that conception that can take the positive parts of it and put it in a new form. Or I need to humble myself and reevaluate what my priors are coming to the conversation. Because, I'm someone who's seen, 12-step basically fail my father, who was an alcoholic, but he'd been to 12-step meetings. And, but also some of the most prominent people in the Baltimore addiction community have a legacy of 12-step and like pure abstinence, like no methadone, no nothing. So I, as a person who is trying to bridge the gap between harm reduction and 12-step, have to take the limitations and positives of both sides seriously, the critiques and the advocacy of both sides seriously, and figure out how my intervention can be useful, how my research can be useful, and how it can create paths of connection between what are oftentimes disparate methodologies.
There was I didn't really appreciate how they were bringing it up in the chat. So they were basically invited to leave, essentially just kicked out. But I'm not entirely mad at some of the underlying question of who gets reparations and how do they factor into the community. So whether it's they were the chatter
I
was
got you.
harping
I've heard
on
this
the
before.
well the chatter was harping on the mixture piece, but then there's the diaspora piece.
Yeah.
Then there's so does LBS have an official position on this or?
Yeah. No official position. Part of it is like that's going to be up to the people on the commission. The theory of the commission is that you have to take into account the specific historical harms of people aggrieved in that community. The logical corollary to that would be that people who are vested in the history, culture, and have a track record of doing work in that community specifically would be preferred in terms of operationalizing the interventions. Now, what those people look like, to me personally, and I believe I can say for LBS in general, is less important than having that experience. Because there are hardcore Black as Stone, American-born descendants of slaves who do not have that organic expertise of the community. And I know for a fact there are white people that do. Right? So some of the people who I've been working with in the addiction space, they've been on Penn North for decades. So I'm not just going to ignore their expertise because they don't have the connection of people of African descent. You know what I mean? So it's one of those things where there's a legal limitation to who you can exclude from an open funding call. But I think that's also for us, we've methodologically structured the reparations framework to prioritize people who've seen and done work in the communities that have been most aggrieved through, specifically in this case, cannabis prohibition, during the periods where cannabis prohibition was most rigorously enforced, which was basically through late 80s, early 90s. So when cannabis in Maryland was decriminalized in, 2015. But what we've seen is that even after decriminalization, in many of these high crime, high arrest neighborhoods, cannabis arrests actually continue to increase even post decriminalization, right? So we just have this long legacy of targeted hyper incarceration. And I don't really care what you look like, but do you have a personal experience working in and a proven record of study and mastery of the history and culture of people who've experienced those unique conditions? Those are the people who I think should be preferred, and our reparations commission structure has been structured to center those people.
Okay, right on. So I know we got about 15 minutes before we have to make way for warrior class. Is there anything, Renee, that you wanted to make sure got spoken on or
No, we
to?
covered
And
all our stuff, but I do think I think there was another question in the chat. I don't.
okay, hold on, wait. Okay, wait, I got that one. Oh, wait, yep, thank you. Craig Bardo is asking, are you building social power or is your emphasis advocacy? Of course, this doesn't have to be binary, but each approach requires something different.
The answer is yes. So, I mean, I think, again, in the traditional funding space, there has to be a dichotomy between research organizations, sometimes legally a dichotomy between human social service organizations, advocacy organizations, and research organizations. We're an LLC, so those don't really mean much to us. So I've explained how we make our money. How we practice that is through this very intentionally interdisciplinary process where we go into community, figure out, because where the needs are is usually where the power has to be built and who the advocacy has to serve. So I can't just say fund grassroots violence intervention because everyone's claiming to be that. I need to do research to be precise about what types of grassroots violence intervention do I think work best and why. And in that case of Baltimore, a black city where mostly people being shot and shooting are black people, it's very intentionally, it's framing that to an analysis of African culture, African-centered interventions, and African-centered theory. Then that builds me to find who's doing that work and building a social relationship with them, building their credibility, going to their work, speaking credibly about them so that they can have increased access to our networks and they can have increased social visibility, and we can be useful to them to the extent we can be. And then the advocacy is designed to fill the role that policy can fill to meet the needs of those organizations. So it's one of those things, again, where it's like the reason why they give us the social connection is largely because of the advocacy, right? So we can't separate the two, because if we're just coming and seeing all the dope stuff they do and writing a report, it makes us look like we thought it up. It's like, that's not valuable to them. It might be a little bit to change the hegemony of expertise in the space. But what it's like, no, it's like, what do you need? Like, we have expertise and capacity that can help you get it. We have connections that can help you get it. And in the process, you build the relationship which helps you do your research, which then builds the social network, which may sometimes mirror what the results of advocacy is. So if the results of advocacy is a fund that redistributes money, then some of the people that helping to construct that fund are going to be from that social network, and some of the people that might get money from that fund might be from that social network. So they all overlap in ways that, I think are very natural to us, but again, may not be the dominant norm in the space intentionally. Because, like I said, there's no law saying you can't engage policy as a nonprofit. But the culture, part of it is just like, and again, this is, I end by saying this. This is not a critique of the people that join these nonprofits. This is to say that, again, it was intentionally constructed in part as a regime of counterinsurgency. Look at White Money, Black Power, McGeorge Bundy, the Ford Foundation, sort of bringing the ideology of developmental separatism from fighting the war in Vietnam to funding Black organizations in America. This is very intentional what's been done to us. And again, they're using our love and desire for us to keep each other employed and alive and whole to lock us into these conceptual boxes. So that separation from the advocacy space, I think, has led to so many regular people saying that, well, I don't know what the revolutionary potential of statewide and local political advocacy is, because so many of the people who I see as credible theorists and organizers aren't directly engaging that. And that's not by accident. So I think it's part of our job to be on platforms like this to show a different side of what is possible. And I think what's happening in Newark, where they cut the murder rate basically in half, I think is an example of an intentionally interdisciplinary community ecosystem built to try to manifest this in flesh and in keeping Black people alive and literally cutting their murder rate in half. And the fact that that's not a nationwide story everybody knows. I think for the fact that, again, nothing is perfect, but the fact that that success story is not something that everybody knows, that Black people did that. Not just Ross Baraka, Black people did that. I think that's just a strong example of what makes me so animated to show the value of this approach.
Right on. Yeah, thank you very much. I think we got time to squeeze this last question in. Kayla's asking, can you say more about how Afro-pessimism guides your navigation of those tensions in behavioral mental health space? Thanks again. Thank you, Kayla.
Maybe. Maybe. Let's actually see if I can. So I don't have a lot of time. I will say that what I'm calling Afro-pessimism may not be what other people call Afro-pessimism. I've conceded that how it frames in my mind is different. Because for me, it's like, I'm going to take the parts that's useful, everything else I'm going to just throw away. Right? So the idea of, and part of it also is that when I'm calling Afro-pessimism, I may not need Wilderson to get to. So part of it is just like the psychoanalytic effects of the racialized subconscious. I mean, that's not just Fanon, but there are lots of other African-centered theorists who I probably would go to before Wilderson for that. But the fact that he talks about it and makes it more mainstream is useful. So partially even talking about like the role of Black people and how we think about crime. Like literally, like, let's start with white people. How white people think about Black youth does not make sense to me without Afro-pessimism. Because he has this whole statement about like, he did organizing and he said that, he called up one of the white conservatives using his white voice. And it's like, well, won't these crazy loony leftists in Berkeley say you're locking kids up? And the white conservative was like, you sound like a nice white guy. You got kids? And he's like, yeah. And he's like, well, who I'm talking about are not kids. They're animals. We're not caging kids. We're caging animals. Like what we're doing in Maryland as a blue state with a supermajority, rolling back youth protections on crime, on criminal justice for youth, doesn't make sense to me without that. Right? So I think that's partially what I'm getting to when it's like there are certain elements of the psychoanalytic analysis that is inflected through Afro-pessimism, but I didn't necessarily, he's not the only guy who does it, that are really useful politically. Same thing with there's another, and part of it is just interviews with him, some of him on your network with you, Jared, but also other interviews where I get his best stuff for me is from that. He's at in front of Lake Merritt in Oakland in 2016 saying, don't dismiss Trump. Because even though white people aren't being honest about it, they find him libidinally refreshing. So I can't just dismiss the threat of Trump winning when everybody, including me to some extent, was looking at the polling and saying he's none. But that's the parts that are useful to me. So it's not just like the human social service methodology part. It's the larger political economy and libidinal economy of anti-Blackness and the libidinal economy of how we theorize the Black body. That is a real material political force that has real material political impacts to the political advocacy that we do. So when we talk about addiction, it's not just a Negro cocaine fiend. It's just this larger libidinal fear of intoxicated Black bodies becoming politically unruly subjects. And that goes deep into like Maryland has not even decriminalized paraphernalia, not less decriminalized drugs, right? So when you talk about Maryland being a slave state, being a southern state, but calling itself this democratic bastion of progressive values, just understanding the libidinal disjunct between how anti-Blackness functions in the libidinal economy and needing Black votes in the material Democratic Party political economy helps me understand like why we have a Democratic Party that can't pass like basic protections for like syringe services programs that help people not get Hep C or AIDS if they happen to be shooting fentanyl, right? And those are the forces that we then have to like, I don't know if I can work on white moderates. So, but I can maybe work on Black folks to see, again, the social life within social death. If I can create a pitch to them that takes the fact that they've been inflected by that libidinal fear and mixed it with the political fear that if I push back against what white people think Black people are, they're going to kick me out of their party. They're going to starve me out. They're going to take my grant away. But also we know we don't want to see our people die. So that might be something I can work with to get like, talk about progressive drug policies, talk about harm reduction with Black people would otherwise write off as conservative Black folks. but they do have maybe something there I can work with that I can't work with frankly even a lot of white leftists. You know, they themselves have like this grudging respect for 12-step and the personal discipline and the disciplining of the mind that comes with like kicking drugs. So that's just all these libidinal, cultural, psychological factors that inflect who I see as targets for political advocacy. Again, I don't necessarily need Wilderson alone for that, but we exist as specters within the white subconscious and imagination, and we exist as that to ourselves. And if you aren't thinking about that, you're at a huge disadvantage when you're doing political organizing.
Very quickly, Librarian, thank you very much for the super chat. Dope, engaging secession. Thank you, Daphne Brown, for the comment and the super chat as well. Raj Singh, thank you as well. Another great live. Thank you very much. I happen to agree. Yeah, Renee, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just gonna say thank you to Lawrence. This was I'm thoroughly engaged in everything that we're talking about, and of course Hiram dropped in a really good question, but we're not gonna have time.
Oh, did he? Dang, I didn't even see it.
He's the worst. He come back with 3 minutes left with questions. So we're gonna have to bring you back, and I'm gonna save the question and I'll drop it in our group email, and then we can try and circle back, and maybe you and Davon can come on at the same time and we can have another conversation. Because for me, again, one of the most important things that I want people to be able to pull from these conversations is how do we do this work? Like, how do you engage this work within a community that needs to figure out how to make actual material changes of their conditions, right? And that's that's everything. That's like the big thing for me. And I really, really appreciate your time. I can't say it enough. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. We actually did make a trip up to Newark to study some of the violence prevention work they're doing. And I'm actually trying to make another one within the next few months. So I'm going to definitely try to holler at you if we do that.
Yes, please do.
And folks, just so you know, the link to Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, their website is in the show description. Please check it out. Lawrence, thank you very much again. Peace to you, because we know you're willing to fight for it. The same goes for everyone in the chat and those who will see and hear this later. Thanks, everybody. We will, of course, see you next time, same place, right here on Saturday with Renee.